Okay, so we're back. So just feeling very good over these past 1 to 2 weeks of just being more intentional with how I start my day. This was a big thing I talked about, and I think it was the last live we did or the last episode. Definitely go and give that a listen or a watch if you haven't already. But I talked a lot about how just being more intentional with your day can just overall impact like how well you execute on some of these things you're trying to execute, right? If you have this fitness or weight loss or some kind of nutrition goal you're trying to hit, even just like other areas too, like career goals. Like for me, it was more a lot of like business wise, where I felt like, I was kind of all scatterbrained, and it's really kind of brought me back down to earth, just being more intentional to start my day. So just been doing that the past 1 to 2 weeks, and it's been feeling really good. Even myself being a coach and having clients and helping clients implement some of these stuff or some of this stuff. Sometimes I forget to do some of these things myself, and I find that I have to like hold myself more accountable and actually follow through with being more intentional to start my day, not just being so reactive, planning things out of when I'm going to do it, how I'm going to do it, and then actually doing it, right? Like I have to implement discipline, just like so many of you. So just been feeling really good, really grateful. A lot of like really huge client wins have been going on too. If you haven't been like paying attention to, any posts in here or or on my Facebook or Instagram stories, just a lot of clients who are experiencing a lot of growth in so many areas, whether it be their journey with fitness specifically, or even just like their life. And it's very cool to see how improving your nutrition, your fitness, your workouts, and achieving weight loss or some kind of body transformation, maybe it's even just feeling better, health-wise, how doing those things can impact, your psychological health and your mental health and how confident you just feel on a day-to-day basis and how you show up. So a lot of really, really cool things happening, in our world. And also some really cool things that I'm kind of working on in the background for this fall, which is not that long or not that far away, I guess. Only really a couple months away until September, which is just like insane. Like where did the summer go? I have no idea. But like I said, really cool stuff happening, in our world right now, in our community. So excited about that. But let's go ahead and just get started with today's topic. If you see from the title of the video, obviously, or the title of this, we're going to talk all about coffee, caffeine, and how it might be sabotaging your weight loss efforts. So if you're watching this, watching it live, I would love to have you comment below if you're somebody who drinks coffee regularly. I'm assuming most people, I feel like nowadays, most people do. My wife, she's kind of a psychopath and never drinks coffee. Even when they have her working these crazy like 24-hour shifts, she doesn't even drink coffee or have caffeine, which is just insane to me. But she's a different breed, I guess. But let me know if you do drink coffee. I'm assuming most people do. And this, Facebook Live and everything, it's not going to be specifically about coffee, but it's going to be about caffeine, which is even more common than coffee, honestly, because caffeine, we can get it from coffee. I know we have a couple people, Dana, Amanda, drinking coffee, regularly. I know Dana, never mind. I was going to call you out regarding the sleep issues. I know you have a lot of sleep issues that we've been working on. So maybe this will be a good one. Maybe it's the caffeine that's kind of contributing to it too. Caffeine is even more common, right? Because you're getting caffeine from coffee, you're getting caffeine from energy drinks, you're getting caffeine from pop or soda, whatever you want to call it. I always grew up calling it pop. And then recently, for some reason, like now I feel weird calling it pop, and now I call it soda. And now I'm kind of in between, like, don't know what to call it. Both words sound weird to me. But anyways, get caffeine from those. So there's caffeine in like so many different like drinks you can buy. So that's even more common than just coffee. So this video, this live, this episode is going to be even more relevant, because even if you don't drink coffee, but if you drink, energy drinks, or you drink pop, it can, you'll relate to it too. So coffee or caffeine is the most commonly used, what's called psychoactive substance, which basically it means that it changes the function of our nervous system, which results in changes in our perception, our mood, our cognition, our behavior. So some people, when they drink caffeine, they might start to feel better, like feel more positive, feel maybe even happier temporarily, be in a better mood. Like I know there's all these memes that go around talking about like, hey, don't talk to me before I have my morning cup of coffee because I'm going to be in a bad mood and all this stuff. And there's some truth to that for some people. Like it really positively impacts their mood in the beginning of the day. So it does change, our mood. It can change our perception of how we perceive like our energy levels, because a lot of people think it actually gives us energy, where it doesn't really give us energy. It just blunts or decreases our feelings of fatigue. So if you're during a workout, right, if you had caffeine before your workout, it could help to where you don't feel as tired during your sets. Or if you have caffeine, in the morning when you're typically really tired, it's going to kind of blunt or get rid of that feeling of being tired. So it changes our perception, right? The average daily caffeine intake is up to around 200 milligrams, like globally, but it can be even more in some countries. And I'm assuming the US is probably on that higher end there. And then in terms of working out, kind of already mentioned it again, caffeine is used a lot of times in pre-workouts to help boost performance, because it can give you that, or it can help reduce those feelings of fatigue. And if you feel less tired as you're working out, you're going to be able to do more sets. You're going to be able to do more reps. You're going to be able to maybe do more weight. So it can help in that sense. But there are definitely obviously things we want to consider with caffeine. Not even just for fat loss, but just in general, right? Like anxiousness. Are you a pretty anxious person? Jitteriness. Like, are you going to feel jittery if you have caffeine during the day or before a workout? And how does that affect you? Do you not like that feeling? Maybe you even get nauseous if you have caffeine without food. Does caffeine cause you to get headaches? Or if you, regularly have caffeine and then one day for whatever reason you don't, do you end up getting headaches from that kind of caffeine withdrawal? And then also obviously like the concept of your body getting used to it too. And, if you normally have, let's say 100 milligrams of caffeine every single morning to help you kind of wake up for work, is your body going to get used to it to where now you need 150 to feel that same feeling? And then eventually, is your body going to get used to it to where then you're going to need 200? And then eventually you're going to have these huge doses of caffeine you're having every single day that end up being out of the realms of safety. So these are all like considerations with caffeine. But in this video, I wanted to talk specifically about how it can affect your fat loss, and specifically how it can affect our sleep. And you're like, how are sleep and fat loss connected? Like, I thought this was about fat loss, but good quality of sleep affects fat loss dramatically. It helps us recover from our workouts better, helps with muscle recovery, muscle repair, helps our bodies to, like, when we're in a calorie deficit and a fat loss or in a fat loss phase, we will burn more fat and maintain more muscle the better sleep we get. Also, obviously, less sleep you get. I'm sorry, I was laughing at Helen's comment. Now it's making her crave coffee. So maybe not exactly the point of this isn't to get you to actually crave caffeine and crave coffee, but yeah. But obviously, getting good quality sleep is going to help with your energy the next day. So you're going to be able to have better workouts. You're also going to be able to move around more, if you have good quality sleep the night before. And then also cravings. That is a big one. Like, people talk about how to manage sugar cravings, how to manage cravings for chocolate, cravings for this, for that. One big thing to look at if you're constantly craving these higher calorie foods or higher sugar foods is look at your sleep. There have been multiple studies that have shown, when we are in a sleep deprived state, or we're not getting good quality of sleep for even just one night, but especially multiple nights, we will crave higher calorie foods. We will crave foods that are more processed. We will crave foods that are higher in sugar, higher in fat, higher in calories, foods that have like high, I don't know the term for it, high taste threshold, I guess, or to where foods that just have highly palatable. That's the term I was thinking of, which basically means that they taste really good. They feel good in our mouth. So a lot of those highly processed, high calorie foods, we're going to want those more if we're getting poor sleep. So if we can fix sleep, that can make a huge impact in your results, because you're going to be able to move more the next day. You're going to be able to focus more the next day. You're going to be able to manage cravings better, not be as hungry, especially not be as hungry for those higher calorie foods. So we all know that there are, some obvious issues with drinking caffeine late in the day, when it comes to sleep, right? Because I don't know about, any of you, maybe you're in high school, maybe you're in college, but I know there were plenty of times for myself during finals week in college, or a week where maybe we had this big paper, this research paper due, or something like that, where I consumed maybe a ridiculous amount of caffeine, maybe a slightly unsafe amount of caffeine in a given day and throughout the night in order to stay up to study. And there's research behind like why that's actually not really that helpful. A lot of times it's more helpful to not study as much but get better sleep. But, obviously, when you're stressed about the exam and everything, you want to get the studying in. So there have been times where I've drank, caffeine throughout the night to stay up. So we all know that caffeine helps us to stay up or makes it harder to fall asleep. And I'm sure we all have experienced in some way, like drinking caffeine, maybe at 5 p.m. or later in the day, and then it being a little bit hard to fall asleep, like maybe tossing and turning a little bit more, or maybe it's like, 9 or 10 p.m. when you normally would fall asleep and you're a little bit more wired or more alert. And you've probably heard some kind of guidelines, and these are things that even I've probably said before, of try not to consume caffeine past 3 p.m. or past this certain time frame. But and I'm going to talk about kind of why I've maybe said these things before, but is, this correct? Is this timeline of like, okay, don't consume it past 3 p.m. Is that right? So we're going to dive in a little bit more specifically about like numbers, what, research has shown, what like new research is saying as far as what the cutoff of caffeine should be, so you get good quality of sleep, so you kind of maximize your fat loss and recovery in that way. And like I said, this is extremely important because sleep is one of the most important variables for fat loss, along with calories, protein, hitting your workouts, and getting movement throughout the week or the day. So this like kind of previous recommendation that I talked about before of around like 7 hours, or I guess around 3 p.m., like cutting your caffeine intake off at 3 p.m. if you go to bed at 10. That kind of came from this study back in 2013 where they had people consume 400 milligrams of caffeine, which is quite a bit of caffeine. 400 milligrams is like approximately 3 to 4 cups of coffee, or approximately, like if you're thinking energy drinks, I know the Monsters, like those 0 calorie, 0 sugar, like white Monster cans that are maybe, I think they're like 12 ounces. Those typically have, I think, around 150-ish milligrams of caffeine. So it's about 2 to 3 of those. So quite a bit of caffeine. But they had people consume these 400 milligrams of caffeine either 0 hours before bed, so like right before bed, 3 hours before bed, or 6 hours before bed. And when they looked at like how this caffeine negatively impacted their sleep, they saw a reduced impact for like the farther out they had the caffeine, which is kind of like obvious, or what you would think would happen. But they actually saw even a slight negative impact on sleep, even 6 hours before bed. And this is where like this kind of recommendation of having it at 3 p.m. if you go to bed at 10, so around 7 hours before, kind of came about, because they're like, okay, 6 had a very minimal impact 6 hours before bed, so let's give the recommendation of 7 hours before bed to be safe. But with this study, they still didn't find what the actual cutoff was. Like 6 hours before bed still negatively impacted sleep a little bit. So what actually is the cutoff? And then obviously the cutoff depends on how much you're having too, right? Like 200 milligrams versus 400 milligrams. There's a big difference, right? And this cutoff, like I said, we didn't find the specific number, so it could have been 7 hours before bed was the actual cutoff, 8 hours before bed, maybe even 10 hours before bed. But this new study came out, which is called a meta-analysis, which a meta-analysis is basically where they take a bunch of studies that are reviewing a certain topic. So like in this case, caffeine and how it impacts bedtime. They take like all these studies and analyze all of them at once and kind of review all of them at once and try to come to some kind of conclusion. So this new kind of meta-analysis or review that came out showed that caffeine intake just in general reduced sleep time by about 45 minutes per day. So people who were not having caffeine maybe slept, let's say, for example, 7 hours per day. People who did around 6 hours and 15 minutes. They saw reduced sleep efficiency, which is basically means how much time you spent like in bed planning to sleep versus the amount of time you slept. So people who had caffeine had lower sleep efficiency, so they spent more time just kind of laying in bed, not sleeping. There was an increase in what's called sleep onset latency, which basically means how long it takes to go from completely awake to sleep. So they saw an increase in that time by like 9 minutes. So people who had caffeine, it took about 9 minutes longer to fall asleep versus people who didn't. And then they also saw that the wake time after they fell asleep increased by about 10 minutes. And what this refers to is if you're waking up in the middle of the night, how long are you kind of awake for in the middle of the night before you fall back asleep? So if you wake up, let's say you go to the bathroom in the middle of the night, you're going to be awake for 10 more minutes if you were a caffeine user versus if you weren't. And these are all obviously averages. There's obviously individual differences in here, but that's kind of what they found. So overall, caffeine wasn't really great for sleep when we looked at all this stuff, which is pretty intuitive, right? Like we all kind of know that because we all drink caffeine to make ourselves stay awake sometimes. But when we look at like the cutoff for having this negative impact, what does that look like? What do those numbers look like? So this not only depends on, like I said, how or when you have it, but it depends on how much you have too. So there is obviously a big difference between 400 milligrams and 100 milligrams of caffeine. But what this study kind of found was that if you're having around 220 milligrams of caffeine, the cutoff time that you want to have that caffeine, and this is going to be kind of depressing to hear probably for a lot of people. It's depressing for me to read. But if you're going to have 220 milligrams of caffeine, that dose, you want to have it at around 8:50 a.m. or around 9 a.m. if you go to bed at 10 p.m. for it not to impact sleep, which is just like a shot to the heart, right? Because 220 milligrams of caffeine, it's quite a bit, right? It's about 2 cups of coffee, but having that cut off at 9 a.m. is 11 hours before bedtime. So that means from there on, you probably don't want to have as much caffeine if you don't want it to impact your sleep. And then they looked at another dose, a 100 milligram dose. So this would be the equivalent of like 1 cup of coffee. You'd want to have that cut off around 1 p.m. for it not to impact your sleep at all, which is still on the earlier end, right? Like these previous recommendations were maybe around 3 p.m. and then this one's at 1 p.m. So even earlier than what we kind of suspected, even just for like 1 cup of coffee. And then anything lower than 100 milligrams, like if you have a can of like Coke Zero, I believe that's like 60, maybe 70 milligrams of caffeine. They didn't really have any like data on that since it's so small and so negligible. But like I said, it kind of made me sad reading this because I like to drink caffeine throughout the day. I personally try to cut off my caffeine at like 2 is kind of where I try to cut it off. But I'm having, even at 2 p.m., I'm having more than 100 milligrams when I do. And, honestly, before I read this, I really didn't think the cutoff would be that early. But, this is me being unbiased and giving you guys the real information here. But also something else to keep in mind too with this is caffeine accumulates in the blood over time. So a 100 milligram dose of caffeine, so 1 cup of coffee at like 1 p.m., that cutoff time that they said, that is going to affect your sleep differently if that's the only caffeine you've had throughout the day versus if you had, let's say, a cup of coffee at 9 a.m. and then another one at 1 p.m. So having just 100 milligrams at 1 p.m. might not affect your sleep at all if that's the only cup of coffee you had. But if you had coffee previously or some kind of caffeine previously, even if you're following that 100 milligram dose at 1 p.m. guideline, it might still negatively impact your sleep later if you had caffeine previously. So that's something else to think about. Also, something else to think about as well is that individual people do metabolize caffeine differently. And you might have heard of this or maybe not, but the half-life of caffeine, which basically is how long it takes for half of the caffeine in your blood to get out of your bloodstream and be like fully metabolized and gone. So the half-life of caffeine is on average about 4 to 6 hours. So it takes around 4 to 6 hours. If you have 200 milligrams of caffeine, it's going to take 4 to 6 hours for 100 milligrams of that to be out of your system. But that is an average. And when we look at individuals, it can range anywhere from 2 hours being the half-life, so half of that caffeine being gone, and up to 10 hours, depending on the person, which is obviously a huge difference. And this is all affected by genes, by your biological sex, by estrogen levels, by where you are in your menstrual cycle, what phase you're in. It can be affected by birth control that you may not be taking. Can be affected by your body composition even. If you smoke, if you're drinking alcohol with it, all of this stuff. So while like that, guideline or these guidelines are averages, each person may be affected differently. But with that, it's still a good idea to probably have your caffeine as early in the day as possible and stop as early as you can, just to try to avoid these negative impacts that it might have on sleep. And also there's this kind of like idea floating around there where like people are claiming to wait to have caffeine like 90 minutes before you wake up. I will say that seems to have like pretty small level of evidence around that. Not saying it's complete like BS or anything, but the evidence doesn't seem like it lines up with, how strong these claims are. So with that, like if you're debating on waiting an hour and a half to have your caffeine just because, and obviously that is making your cutoff time for caffeine later, might be actually, a fine idea to experiment with bringing your caffeine intake a little bit sooner and maybe not waiting the full 90 minutes just because, some posts on the internet said it. But also another kind of note or consideration with this is if you are somebody who has pre-workout before you go and work out and you work out maybe in the afternoon or later in the evening, it's probably a good idea to really look at that pre-workout and see if it has caffeine in it. Because I would say most pre-workouts do. But there are what's called stimulant-free pre-workouts you can buy that have some other ingredients that might potentially impact or like help your performance in the gym, help you stay focused, but they don't have the caffeine or stimulant to it. And that would be definitely something I'd recommend if, like I said, if you work out in the afternoon or in the evening, because that will, negatively impact sleep, if you're having that pretty close to bedtime or late at night. And also another note too is like you might be listening to this or watching this and think like, well, I have caffeine at 6 p.m. I have an energy drink then and I fall asleep fine. Most people, when they do have poor sleep, especially if they've had it for so long, their body starts to get used to it. And their body doesn't get used to it in a sense of where it's not negatively impacting them anymore. It's just they don't notice it. Like they're still having poor recovery. They're still having lower energy throughout the day. They're still feeling sluggish, but that's just become like their baseline. They just baseline don't recover as well. They baseline just feel more fatigued throughout the day. So if you're one of those people who are having caffeine late at night and you're like, it's not affecting me, probably is. So still pushing forward, having your caffeine earlier in the day, it's still a good idea, even if you feel like it's not really affecting you. So like with all this, new research and all this, like will I change my habits, like my habits, because of this? Because like I said, I typically have around like maybe a 1 cup of coffee first thing in the morning at like 7, and then I have probably some kind of pre-workout that's around 200 milligrams at maybe like 11 a.m. most days. My schedule fluctuates a little bit, but that's kind of standard. So like, sure, I'm having and then on top of that, a lot of times I have another cup of coffee at like maybe 2. So I'm going past these guidelines. Plus I'm having more caffeine doses, earlier in the day. I just always try to keep my caffeine, my total throughout the day below 400 milligrams or 400 milligrams at the highest. And that's what I recommend for most people. That's kind of been the amount that, has been shown to be safe to consume. Obviously, if you're pregnant or breastfeeding, those recommendations change, so just keep that in mind. But other than that, 400 milligrams max per day is kind of like the max safe level. So I always try to keep my caffeine, lower than that, or like at max that. But will I change, my total caffeine habits because of this? I definitely will try. I'm going to try to be more mindful regarding this. And this is something that, like, I think it's a good kind of conversation to have is, right, I laid out all these numbers, laid out this research. And it's important to realize, I'm talking about, this research is talking about how much or where to have your cutoff so your caffeine impacts your sleep, which then can impact your fat loss, 0%, right? We're talking about the cutoff for it not to impact it at all. Now, if you have caffeine at 1:30 p.m., instead of 1 p.m., maybe your sleep gets impacted by a few percentage points, right? Like if we were to put your, map your sleep on a graph or something and find out the exact percentage of how many minutes decrease you saw of sleep, maybe it decreased by, 3%. And then maybe you have caffeine at, 6 p.m. and you have, 200 milligrams and your sleep decreases by maybe like 20%, right? And it's a big difference. So it's not this black and white thing of if you have caffeine after 1 p.m. that, your sleep sucks, right? And it's terrible. Your sleep just might not be as good necessarily as it would be if you cut it off before, right? So with anything regarding nutrition, with working out, there's always like a gradient or like a spectrum of, okay, this is 100% optimal, this is really terrible or not optimal at all, and then there's this middle ground, right? So when you're thinking about what habits to change and everything, there's a give and take. So if I decrease my caffeine intake and cut it off by what these recommendations said or what this research study said, maybe because I'm cutting off my caffeine, maybe let's say I'm like less productive in the like early afternoon with something, or maybe I don't have as good of a workout and that impacts my progress in that way, or this and that. So with that, I don't want you to like walk away from this and think like, like I'm screwing up my fat loss progress or my weight loss progress if I have caffeine at 2 p.m. Like I don't want you to walk away from this video or this episode and listening to this and think that, right? But I want you to think, okay, just in general, the principle of the earlier I can cut off my caffeine, probably the better for sleep, probably the better for managing cravings, probably the better for recovery. So I'm going to try to maybe push that back, as much as I can. And maybe like if you're someone who has caffeine regularly at 3 p.m. every single day, maybe don't cut it back to 1 o'clock right away. Maybe cut it back to 2:30, and then after a few weeks, cut it back to 2, and then after a few weeks, maybe cut it back to 1:30, and slowly, gradually bring that back, and do it that way instead of thinking in such black and white terms. So hopefully that was kind of helpful as far as just like conceptualizing how to use this information to make a change. Because I think with nutrition research, especially, we find research that shows, okay, this isn't that great, and think we have to go in that total opposite direction of the spectrum to then, avoid it, when really we can make like small incremental changes and still see a benefit, with this, with sleep and, other things regarding nutrition and everything. So, hopefully this was helpful. And like I said, just to connect the dots, good quality of sleep, making sure we are prioritizing that is super important for fat loss, for recovery, for energy, for our workouts, for just energy to move around and get movement in the next day. And then also plays a huge impact in managing hunger and cravings too. So, yeah, hopefully this was helpful. Hopefully this was eye-opening. Hopefully you're not as depressed as I was after reading this. Not really. I'm not like addicted to caffeine or anything, but I do like to have a little bit of coffee in the afternoon. So probably will try to start to slowly shift that back to fall a little bit more in these guidelines. Because I know, if I do that slowly over time, it will probably help to improve sleep, which then can, improve your life in many other ways, especially fat loss. So hopefully this was helpful. Definitely, share this with somebody if you thought it was. Tag them. No, go and find your friend who drinks way too much coffee and drinks way too much caffeine, and send them this video or send them this group, send them the link to this or whatever, and tell them, okay, this dietitian is saying that you need to cut off your coffee intake, just to freak them out. But make sure they actually listen to it and don't just take that as a blanket statement, because I don't want people getting the wrong impression. But yeah, I think that's about it. Hope you guys enjoyed it. Share it, if you thought it was helpful, and I will see you guys in the next one.